Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Curtis Kemple, a developer advocate with AWS Mobile. And today, we're going to take a look at Android authentication on AWS with AWS Amplify. In this session, you'll learn how to implement authentication for Android apps using Amazon Cognito user pools and AWS Amplify. First, we'll take a little look at identity management, and then we'll dive into how Cognito user pools work. And lastly, we'll take a look at setting up authentication in an Android app using AWS Amplify. When we think of identity management, Wikipedia says it enables the right individuals to access the right resources at the right times and for the right reasons. Now, while this is very simple and straightforward, this can actually be extremely difficult to implement in your apps. There's a lot of nuance and edge cases that go into identity and authentication, and neither one is really easy to set up. When it comes to identity management and accessing data, you have multiple data access patterns: public data access, private data access, and custom data access. Let's take a look at each one of those in a little bit more detail. Public data access, the data is not user specific, and there's no restriction imposed on the data. This means that anybody, whether authenticated or not, is free to look or use that data. Private data access, on the other hand, is data that can be private to a specific user or group, and the access to data is often privileged or restricted. Custom data access is data that at different times might be private or public. Access to the data could be privileged or restricted at a given time, or maybe access to data can be further guarded by application logic. Essentially, identity management equals auth-n and auth-z together. Auth-n means authentication, and auth-z stands for authorization. One, auth-n, is about identifying who the user is, and auth-z is about identifying what that user has access to. In AWS and in AWS Amplify, there's often four types of authorization that you'll come across. No authentication, which again would be for anybody would be able to access. And most times you can access services like AWS AppSync, which is a GraphQL service, with something like an API key only. However, for private custom data access, oftentimes you'll have to resort to something else, like Cognito user pools, which we'll talk about in more detail, OpenID Connect authorization, and AWS IAM authorization. Amazon Cognito user pools start by first sending a request from the device to Amazon Cognito. Once Amazon Cognito verifies the identity, it can then pass that information on to other AWS services, like AWS AppSync. As you can see, once the authorization has happened, it will allow actions to be done in AppSync, which would then allow you to further work with more AWS services. Switching gears, talking about Amplify framework as a whole and what it does to help you manage that kind of complexity. First off, I want to talk about what essentially is Amplify framework. So in all of its pieces together, there's a CLI, there's client libraries, both native and JavaScript support, pre-built UI components, and a toolchain. And all of these pieces are built to work with each other to make it extremely quick and simple to set up any type of services from authentication to APIs. Some common workflows that you might see when dealing with Amplify framework: deploying a Lambda function with API gateway, adding authentication to your app, which we'll take a look at in detail, deploying a GraphQL API, or adding analytics. There's also more categories that are supported that we'll take a look at. The CLI helps you create, update, and delete cloud services. These services are controlled by CloudFormation templates, or stacks. The CLI makes essentially DevOps a hands-free job by creating these templates and stacks for you. It also allows you to manage multiple environments. An environment is all of the services and configuration necessary to run a given application or service or feature. You might think of environments for having one for development, one for testing, and then one for your production application. GraphQL transforms and code generation are something that the CLI can also do. There are multiple categories that you can use with the CLI. The one that we will take a look at today in depth is authentication. However, Amplify CLI makes it much easier to add other services that are very important to any production application, such as file storage, push notifications, analytics, and both REST and GraphQL APIs. The Amplify CLI is used by using commands like amplify add, amplify push, amplify configure, amplify delete, and amplify code gen. By running these different commands, you're actually either updating, creating, deleting CloudFormation templates, or maybe configuring an already existing service, or pushing all of the information or the changes that you've made to AWS. Another part of the Amplify framework is the native client SDK. The native client SDK is opinionated, declarative, client-focused, has high-level abstractions. It's got best practices built in for things like authentication, configuring APIs, but it does allow you to override that and basically configure them any way that you need. And they're all also built with the Amplify CLI in mind. What this means is that you can create these different services or different categories, if you will, and workflows, and they all work together seamlessly because they're all being backed and powered by the CLI. So if we were going to add an authentication service to our app, it would look something like this. We would run amplify add auth, and then from there, we would be given a list of configuration options. We could either choose the default or choose to customize this configuration, as you'll see in a little bit during a live demo. The next step would be to import the dependency client SDK, the SDK for user pools in this case, because we're dealing with authentication. And also in this case, we'll be looking at some drop-in UI components. So for here, we would want the Android SDK Auth UI. Now, you don't have to use the drop-in authentication components at all. There's also API, which we'll look a little bit more at, that allows you to customize and create any type of authentication that you want. Once you've added your dependencies, the next step to getting started is setting up an authentication activity. And this activity would be responsible for managing the state of whether or not a user is logged in, and you would also make this your launcher activity. This way, users would be forced to either log in or be met with a login screen before they could get to your app. Now, you don't have to choose to make the authentication activity your main activity. Maybe only an admin section of your app actually requires login. You can also specify at any point in your app to launch the sign-in activity. Setting up sign-in with the drop-in UI is a one-liner. So here we have the mobile client. We just get the instance and call show sign-in. If you look closely, just beyond the Sign-in UI Options Builder, it says Next Activity. Here, we're just passing in main activity, but this is essentially saying after a successful sign-in, navigate to this next activity. So now that we've taken a second to talk about Cognito user pools and building authentication into our Android apps, let's look at a live demo. Next, we'll jump into Android Studio and we'll actually just create a new project. We'll choose Empty Activity and hit Next. For the application name, I'm going to change this to My Example Project. I'm going to change the save location to my desktop just to make this easier. I'm going to leave the language as Java and set the minimum API level and leave that as the default. Now that we have a new project, the first thing that I need to do is go back and actually turn this into an Amplify project. To do that, we go to the root directory of the project and we run amplify init. Amplify init will essentially create the basic CloudFormation templates that are needed, any configuration for the project, as well as setting up some things like what type of project it is. So here, I'm going to pick the default name. As I mentioned before, you can have multiple environments for your app. For this one, I'm just going to choose Master. Here, for the default text editor, I use Visual Studio Code, but you can pick any of these options. As you can see, Android is highlighted here because it actually knows that we're inside of an Android project. And it will actually check to see what kind of project that you're working on and then offer you smart defaults based on that. So our rest directory, app source main res. Now, this next question is, do I want to use an AWS profile? In order for Amplify to be able to make these decisions and do this work on your behalf, it has to have access to your AWS console. So this means you have to configure a user with the proper permissions. Now, I already have a user. If this is your first time using Amplify, you would actually be prompted to open up the console and create the user. But don't worry, because the CLI walks you through that entire process. So now, the project is being initialized. While that's happening, let's come back to our main project here in Android Studio, and let's go ahead and run it on a virtual device. I already have a Pixel 2 virtual device, so I'll pick that and hit OK. As you can see, our project has been successfully initialized and it's connected to the cloud. So now, if I actually run ls here in this example, we'll see that there's an Amplify folder that has been created. If I cd into that, we have a couple things: current cloud backend, and team provider info.json. These are just some of the files that are necessary for Amplify to do its job. So we don't really have to mess with this at all, but sometimes maybe if you had a GraphQL API or were doing something else, you might actually have to dig into this file and edit your schema or something like that. But for now, we can cd back up to the root of our project. So now that we have Amplify initted, the next thing that we need to do is actually add in a category. Since we're going to be covering authentication, that's what I'm going to add. We do that by running amplify add command, and then we specify the category that we want to add. In this case, auth. Amplify is going to, again, ask me a couple questions just to figure out what kind of authentication it is I'm trying to add. I believe it's being held up by my virtual device starting. As you can see, it says the current configured provider is Amazon Cognito. This is what we want because we're going to be using a Cognito user pool to handle our authentication. Because of this, and because we're not using a social provider, something like Facebook or GitHub, we can just go ahead and choose default configuration. So next it's asking, how would we like them to be able to sign in? In this case, I'm just going to pick username. And do we want to configure advanced settings? No, I am done. So, here we go. Our example project is built and running, and now we have authentication added. As you can see under next steps, it says Amplify Push will build all of your local backend resources and provision it to the cloud. Amplify Publish would build all of that and provision it. We don't actually need that second part. That's more based for web apps or things like that. You can actually host them very easily. In this case, we're just going to do Amplify Push. The first thing Amplify will do is prompt me and say, hey, these are the categories that you have changed or things that will change if you continue to do this push. Are you sure that this is something that you would like to do? So as you can see here, we have the category auth. We've given a resource name. It's going to create it, and the provider plugin is AWS CloudFormation. So what provider plugin means is the entire CLI is actually built as a plugin system. And while most of the plugins that are currently available are based on AWS technologies, you can actually create plugins to work with other cloud providers and services to really extend and meet all of your needs. Maybe you have something else like video streaming or something coming from another platform. It makes it easy to integrate these things into a unified workflow for your teams. I'm going to hit yes, that I'm sure we would like to continue. So now, Amplify is actually updating these resources in the cloud. And as you might imagine, with creating all this configuration and spinning up any necessary resources like our Cognito user pool, this could take a few minutes. So while that's happening, let's jump back into the Android project and let's make a few changes so that we can actually add authentication. The first thing that we're going to want to do is add some changes to our Android manifest. So the first thing is we're going to change how the activities work. So in this case, we have main activity, and it's structured to be the launcher activity. I'm going to increase this font size to make it a little easier to see. So again, we have our main activity, and it's set as the launcher. But what we're going to do is replace this, and we're going to make the main activity just a regular activity. We're then going to create another activity called Authentication Activity, and we're going to set this one as the launcher. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and now let's do that. So I go to File, New Activity. um, activity. And then here, again, we'll choose empty activity. For this one, we're going to name it Authentication Activity. And we will keep all the rest of the default settings. Now, before we can update authentication activity, first we have to add our dependencies. So in order to do that, we have to go to our project build.gradle, or our apps.build.gradle, excuse me, and add our needed dependencies. So what we're adding here, as covered before, is the mobile SDK, the user pools auth SDK, and we're going to do some drop-in UI. Oh, it looks like so. If you're doing the drop-in UI, another thing to note is your minimum SDK version must be bumped from 15 to 23. However, that's only necessary if you're using drop-in UI like we are in this example. So now that our configuration is added, let's come back to the authentication activity and let's paste in our class that will handle login. So now that we have our class, let's take a second to go over what's happening. In our Oncreate, so as soon as our activity is created and launched, we're going to call initialize on the AWS mobile SDK. Once we're initialized, we're going to add our method for onResult, which is going to give us the user state details. Once we have the user state details, we can get the user state and figure out whether or not the user is signed in, signed out, or in some other default state. In this instance, if we were to restart the app now, because the user has not signed in, ideally they should be shown the sign in. And again, if we look at show sign in, like I showed in the slides before, it's just this one-liner to call show sign in and then pass them on to the main activity to complete authorization. So here I'm just making sure that it's using the right callback and we have no errors, and then we're going to rebuild the application. So as you can see here, we still have the example project because I don't believe that I have saved the manifest yet. Here we go. Okay. So I'm actually, because it was a lot of changes and changes to the manifest, I'm actually going to stop the build and rerun it because I'm not able to do quick changes because we've changed configuration to the overall application. So here I'm just waiting for the build to run. So while we do that, let's jump back over here to the terminal. So as you can see, the work has been done and all of our resources have been created, from identity pools to our Cognito user pools. Now, Amplify has a neat command called console. So if I run amplify auth console, what this will do is ask me what I want to look at in the console, and then it will actually open that up for me. Now, I might not be currently logged into the console, so we would have to wait and see if it will actually take me to the window or just to AWS console. But look at this. So if we come back over to our app that has built, you can see that we have this sign in with a username or phone number and password. And so we haven't written really almost any code to accomplish this, any UI specifically. All that we have done is add this new launcher activity called Authentication activity that is responsible for doing this. And because we're not logged in, it has chosen to show us the sign up. So in just 1 second, we'll create a new account. But first, let's go back to the terminal and try to look at the user pool. So I'm not logged in, so I cannot show you that at the current time. However, if you wanted to navigate to the console very easily to look at whether it's your GraphQL APIs, your authentication, or analytics, that's a very nice shortcut to do so. So let's go over here to create a new account. So in this, I will just pick a username and a password that meets. And then for email address, and for phone number, I will just put a fake one. So we hit sign up. Phone number, I forgot to do the +1. Okay, so I have signed up. It has sent me a confirmation code to my email. So if I jump into here, and the very first code that I am given, or very first email that I see, is my verification code. So this has set up an entire workflow for sign in, sign up. Oh, I cannot paste into that, so let me go ahead and 596863. And there we go. So it has redirected us to the main application. So as I was saying, with adding this activity in about 30 lines of code, our entire login, sign up, sign out, forgot password flow has been created and added for us. And not to mention that our user data is being stored in Amazon Cognito user pools, which can scale to millions of users and will definitely grow with you as your project grows in size. Right, so this is just a small example to show how quickly and easily you can add these different categories and these different workflows or use cases to your applications with Amplify. In this case, specifically authentication. So from here, if I were to add a REST API or GraphQL API, because it's all being done through Amplify and through the CLI, as I'm building my app, it has awareness of these other systems. So once logged in, if I do anything like request data or do that, it's automatically sending the proper information, proper tokens, along with those requests to make it work for that user. So again, it takes the hassle of having to manage all of this stuff on your own and puts it off onto the toolchain and the services and the SDK, and allows you to focus on what matters most, which is building your product. So using drop-in authentication is not the only way to work with the authentication module from the client SDK. So you can also just call the functions for sign up, confirm sign up, sign in, and sign out, all these. You can also configure the UI for the drop-in UI components. And there are other components that are very useful for common UI things that are very themable and customizable that make it very easy for things like a photo picker for uploading and storing files, or a list view for looking at photos or files out of an S3 bucket. And they're all just made to work together. So at the end of the day, what you get to do is just import and use these tools, and then, as I said before, just build the product. So I really hope you enjoyed seeing what it was like to use something like a drop-in UI and how fast and easy you can add authentication to your Android apps. And if you are interested in finding out more, I definitely encourage you to take a look at the docs and read up about the other categories and what you can do with Amplify today in native. Thank you.